is March 4th at 5:05 p.m. I'd like to call to order this meeting of the Board of Directors of the Palo Alto Public Improvement Corporation. Clerk, if you could please take the roll.
Board Member Cormack?
Here.
Board Member Du Bois? Here. Chair Filseth? Board Member Fine?
Here.
Board Member Nis? Here. Board Member Koo?
Here.
Board Member Tanaka? 5 present.
Thank you. Chair or Mayor Filseth is just taking care of some business quickly, and we'll get through this Public Improvement Corporation and then move on to the main agenda where we're looking forward to welcoming you all. So we have one action item. It's the approval of the fiscal year 2018 Public Improvement Corporation Annual Financial Report. Does staff have a presentation?
No, we don't. Staff does not have a presentation at this time. This is an annual report from a financial standpoint. It's a clean report. And the PIC is the organization that allows the city to go out for debt. Most recently, actually, last Tuesday, the city went out for the Calav garage debt. In the report tonight before you, we only have the debt that was issued last spring for the golf course.
Thank you. Our chair is now here, but I guess if there are any questions, motions? We're on the Public Improvement Corporation meeting. It's the first little meeting before the main meeting.
I guess I'll move approval of the staff motion.
All right, so we have a motion to approve the report by Councilmember Du Bois, seconded by Councilmember Nis. Do you want to speak to your motion?
No.
Nope.
All right. Mr. Mayor, should we vote?
Please vote on the board.
That passes unanimously with Councilmember Tanaka absent. Okay, and now we will reconvene as the City Council Monday, March 4th at about 5:05 p.m. Call this meeting to order. If the clerk could please take the roll.
Councilmember Cormack?
Here.
Councilmember Du Bois? Here. Mayor Filseth?
Here.
Vice Mayor Fine?
Here.
Councilmember Nis? Here. Councilmember Koo?
Here.
Councilmember Tanaka? 6 present.
Thank you. Our first special order of the day is the recognition of the Palo Alto student winners from the 2018 Synopsis Science Fair. And
I believe we were expecting Forrest Williams to be here, but I do not see him in our chambers. As such, do we have Synopsis winners here? We do? Well, perhaps we should proceed with that recognition. Do you have...
sorry, I don't want. Yeah. Thank you.
Texting Tanaka.
Okay. All right, and so the mayor is going to come down, and as your name is read, please come up. He'll give you your recognition. And for the parents, please do take a photo.
Aditi Jain from the girls' middle school, second place for 7th grade. Yuting Chang, honorable mention, 7th grade from JLS, or Lathrop Middle School.
Nicely.
Ayanu Olakotun, honorable mention, grade 8. Roy Gross, first place, 7th grade from Carmen Middle School. Justin How, first place, 7th grade from Tarman Middle School. Tasha Lara, first place, 7th grade from Tarman Middle School. Mahir Borkar, 11th grade, Gunn High School.
Carly Howe?
Thank you. Carly Howe, 2nd place, 11th grade from Gunn High School. Ryan May, 1st place, 11th grade, Gunn High School. Daniel Ong, honorable mention, 11th grade, Gunn High School. Isabel Sparandio, honorable mention, 10th grade, Gunn High School. Romelia Sangatelian, 1st place, 11th grade, Los Altos High School. And then if we could invite all of you up to take a picture in front of the full council.
All right. So we have another recognition item to do, which is the winners of the 2019 Palo Alto City Library Kids and Teens Writing Contest. And Monique,
Yep.
welcome.
Hi, I'm Monique Ziesenhenne, Director of Library and Community Services. And I am going to turn this over to Liz Stewart, our senior librarian, who has been in charge of this program this year. And she will announce the winners of the different age groups and talk about the program.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. Just a really quick little bit of information about the writing contest. It had been going on for many years and then took a short break, I think in the 13, 14 years. I think mostly due to the libraries getting, facelifts and new buildings. And in 2015, we started it back up again because it was a really popular program and had been asked about. And so this is our 4th year since restarting it. It's for students in grades 3 to 12, and they are asked each year between December 1st and the first Sunday in January to submit a piece of work that's 500 words or less that addresses a prompt in different one each year. This year's was, the year is 25-25, and I was late to school again. So entries are divided into 3 age categories: 3rd through 5th grade, 6th to 8th, and 9th to 12th. And then judging for the writing contest is done by volunteers in the community, 2 teacher librarians and 2 either former or retired librarians for the city of Palo Alto. And this year we had 113 entries. So you can imagine those volunteers, we love them much because they read quite a few essays and judged them for us. And we award in each age group 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, and then Librarian's Choice, which is just an additional prize that we, the librarians that run the contest, get to choose because we get to read the essays, but we don't judge them. So we decided we wanted a hand in that. And of course, no one minds an extra award. The participants who win get varying levels of gift cards to Books Inc., and then everyone gets a certificate of their participation and a Book Bucks certificate to the Friends of the Palo Alto City Library book sales, and of course they are our sponsor for this program. They make it a possibility. And so without further ado, I will introduce the winners. Unfortunately, because families in Palo Alto, as you know, are very busy, we don't have many of our winners here tonight. But if you are here, please just come up when I call your name. So we're going to start with the kids' age category. We have 1st place was Ya'an Shea. 2nd was Lucy Kim. And I believe Lucy Kim is going to be here, but she may be running late. She is here. Lucy Kim, and 3rd place was Delari Tarwi, and Librarian's Choice was Brightwell Yolka. Teens, so middle grade, 6th to 8th, our 1st place winner was Vandana Ravi. Second place was Macy Lee. Kylie Hugh was 3rd place, and our Librarian's Choice was Sydney Ling. And then for high school, our 1st place was Sophia Maroulis. 2nd was Alexander Maroulis. 3rd, William Sin. And Librarian's Choice was Sadie Ibsen Brown. Those were our winners for the 2019 Palo Alto City Library Writing Contest.
Maybe we could give everybody a round of applause.
Can we all do a photo with you guys again?
Yeah.
Yeah, you guys stand,
We'll come join you.
and all of you who were winners, please come up.
Councilmember Cormack, would you like to speak?
I wonder if, we might in the future have some sort of link to the science projects and maybe where the short stories are posted, just for our benefit and for anyone who's looking at it on the future on the agenda.
An excellent idea. Good idea. So, all the winners, congratulations again. Thank you for joining us. All right, nicely done. With that, we move on to our next item, which is a closed session involving two discussions with the city attorney, one involving a liability claim against the city by Comuna Capital, and the other in the case of Miriam Green versus City of Palo Alto. May I have a motion to go into closed session, please?
So move that we move to closed session to discuss two items as described by the mayor.
Moved by Councilmember Niss, seconded by Vice Mayor Fine. Would you vote on the board, please? And that passes unanimously with Councilmember Tanaka absent. And so we will return in a couple of hours, I think. So that's the estimation. This could take a while. So please don't wait unless you brought some food. Thank you.
It's great.
Do I actually get a chance to use this thing? I thought it was symbolic. Right. The council has returned from closed session with no reportable action. And so we will resume. We are a bit early. We're about a half an hour ahead of schedule. And with that, we move to agenda changes, additions, and deletions.
Let's see,
Are there any-
no changes from staff, other than, Mayor, did you want to make any comment regarding oral communications?
Oral communications, yes. I think I will. So since we are, oral communications is noticed for 7:40 this evening, which is 40 minutes from now. I think that it would be appropriate of us to accept further oral communications after the last action item if anybody comes to speak who wishes to and doesn't get a chance to, because by 7:40 we'll be into action items. Other than that, I have no agenda changes. Seeing no others, we move to city manager comments.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. I have a few items of note. Let's see. First, in terms of a few items from our community services department, wanted to note that this past Thursday, City was notified that we had received an award of excellence from the California Parks and Recreation Society in the category of facility design for the Baylands Golf Links. As everyone's growing favorite local golf course, the award recognizes the course's contribution toward environmental sustainability, accommodation of flood protection needs, and preservation of land for future recreational usage. Golf course design incorporates aesthetic and environmental play features with additional vegetation and wetlands. Selection of turf grass tolerant of recycled water has allowed for major reduction in potable water consumption. A flood levee expansion to the footprint of the prior golf course also provides safety to homes and businesses. So really kudos to our staff, both in community services as well as the Public Works Department for this tremendous community asset. Upcoming items for those who are focused on summer camp signups. The submissions for the draw for summer camp enrollments are due this Friday, March 8th by 5:30 p.m. at any one of our Palo Alto community centers or the Arts Center. Staff will begin processing camp registrations on March 11th, next week. Check your Enjoy catalog account or account for kids or family to see the camps with which you have been enrolled. Residents will have another chance to register beginning March 21st, either in person, online, or by mail. Also upcoming International Cultural Exchange Week at the Arts Center. 5 visiting artists will present their unique mastery of various traditional Chinese methods for creating contemporary ceramics, starting on Friday, March 15th, with a kickoff reception. The artists will share their expertise in wheel-thrown pottery, handmade brush making, traditional Chinese brush painting, and I'm going to mess this up, Yijing teapot making. The Cultural Exchange Week will include hands-on workshops, demonstrations, and open studio opportunities to see the artists at work. The week will conclude with a one-day exhibition celebrating the work of all participating artists on Sunday, March 24th, from noon to 4 p.m. We do have 2 transportation-related items. First, on bicycle helmet use, city transportation staff recently conducted an observation of the Cal Ave Tunnel bike traffic and found that 93% of student bicyclists were wearing helmets. That's good news. On the other hand, only 70% of the adults were wearing helmets. So the kids get an A and the adults get a C. I kid you not, they wrote that in here. Helmet uses...
And usually those riding on Alma Street without a light at night.
Oh my, there you go. Helmet use is included in more than 65 in-school safe routes to school bicycle safety class and held for PAUSD students each year. Let's see, next. On the Safe Routes to School program, This partnership is working with Green Middle School students to create a walk and roll map for East Palo Alto Voluntary Transfer Program students. Project is aimed to coincide, or timed to coincide with the opening of the new Clark Avenue Highway 101 pedestrian bicycle overcrossing, currently under construction and set to open in late April or early May, depending on weather. The completed map will be available by early to mid-May and will join the suite of existing walk and roll maps available on the Palo Alto Safe Routes to School website. And final note, not that I know that this is already on your calendars, that tomorrow, the community is invited to the Mayor's State of the City address at the El Palo Alto Room at Mitchell Park Community Center. Doors will open at 6:30 p.m. to the public, with the Mayor's address scheduled to begin roughly 7 p.m. I look forward to seeing everyone tomorrow evening. That concludes my report.
Thank you. We may now move on to oral communications, where members of the public may speak to any item not on the agenda. Do we have any cards? Seeing none, we move on to the consent calendar. May I have, let's see, are there minutes? There's not minutes. So we have a motion to approve the consent calendar from former Mayor Niss. Do I have a second? So let me get a second, and then I will call on council members Du Bois and Koo. It's seconded by council member Du Bois. Council member Koo, do you wish to register a no vote?
Registering number 6 and number 8.
6.
No votes on 6 and 8.
Thank you. Council member Du Bois, do you wish to register a no vote? Okay. With that, would you vote on the board, please? And that passes unanimously with Councilmember Tanaka absent. Councilmember Koo, would you care to speak to your no votes?
Okay. So number 6 is reporting the 2018 Annual Comprehensive Plan. So I didn't certify the FEIR nor approve the comp plan when it first came out. I felt the process was chopped up, and there wasn't a implementation element in the plan at the time the FEIR and the balance of the comp plan was adopted. CEQA prohibits the chopping up or segmentation of projects to avoid full and accurate assessment of the environmental impacts on the environment. Just as important is the city's failure to actually require consistency when taking discretionary actions should be in the report. How can the elimination of downtown CAP and its obvious link to the President Hotel be found to be consistent with all the comp plan housing element goals and policies for preserving existing housing as well as future housing opportunities? The city has a mandatory duty to implement the comp plan and hasn't. I'm not supporting a report that conveniently ignores the segregated method of its adoption or the failure to implement its provisions for preservation of housing. Regarding number 8, we are going to be looking at the small cell antenna ordinance in order to update it, and I think that we could wait until that ordinance comes before us before we move ahead with a license agreement with Crown Castle. That's it.
Thank you. Let's see. With that, we move on to the first action item and only action item, which is the 2020 to 29 long-range financial forecast. And staff have a presentation.
Good evening, Council. I am Kylie Nazay, the interim Administrative Services Director, and I'm here with what will be Steve Guagliardo and Paul Harper, who are in charge of the budget office during this interim period. Before you today is the long-range financial forecast, apologies. This is a nice review of our short-term and long-term financial outlook, but it's the general fund only. It provides insight into, it's basically the kickoff to our annual budget process. It provides us a high-level overview of where we're at and potentially where we're going to help inform our policy decisions on any given Monday, as well as through the budget deliberation process. And of biggest note this year, there was a material change from our past practice. Based on City Council direction back in, I think it was November or October, we changed the discount rate, which is the assumed rate of return for our pension formulas, for what's called normal cost, also known as pay-go cost. And so as part of that calculation, it increased our annual contributions for retirement costs by almost $4 million citywide.
It's general fund, right?
Correct. Citywide general fund. Good clarification. The Finance Committee reviewed this report back in November and recommended by a majority vote to accept the long-range financial forecast and forward it to Council for approval. Due to the fact that it wasn't a unanimous vote, that is why this item is on action for your review this evening. Major discussion points from it were I'm going to say the Finance Committee said, how do we know we're doing a good job? And so it was a question about, what are the significant changes from the long range to your proposed budget? How on was your budget, your long range from the prior year versus the coming year? So those were some takeaways that staff had from the Finance Committee meeting to work into our 2020 budget process and obviously future long-range financial forecasts as well. And there was a lot of acknowledgement, obviously, over the change in the rate of return and that more conservative assumption. So tonight, at your places, you have the full PowerPoint from the Finance Committee, but we thought since a majority of you have heard it, we'll hit the highlights. But by all means, please stop us or ask us to go back if you have questions on specific slides or pages. All right, so let's see, let's go to slide 5. On slide 5, you can see the overall status of the general fund from a long-range perspective. The blue line is your one-time net operating margin. What that means is if you did nothing, if you didn't increase your revenues, if you didn't change your expense complement, obviously, naturally, you've got things like inflation baked into these. This is where we would be financially. It assumes we don't solve anything, and it would take until about 2024 for the city to break even between revenues and expenses in the general fund. What the red line shows is if we cure that gap between revenues and expenses, then by 2022, the problem is solved. So it doesn't go on to 2024, that beginning in 2022, you will have aligned your revenues and your expenditures on a sustainable longer-term path. Again, bear in mind, this does include that 6.2% assumption. So that does mean that we are contributing at a more conservative rate, or from a investment returns perspective, or a more aggressive contribution rate if you want to look at it in terms of how much your expenses are going to go up for retirement costs over this forecasted period. So at a high level, this is where we're at. I keep going to the wrong slides. This is just those factors in a numeric form, and most important in this slide is just we can't predict the future. So as you move out in this long-range forecast, the further out you get, the more probably perfect, let's say, the estimates are. So staff really uses this document and credits the first few years to help from a planning perspective, and in the out years are just a gauge. Really important, slide 7 is where we should spend some time. This is a high-level look at where the year-over-year expenses are happening. On this end of things, if you look at the financial forecast and you look at general fund expenses from 2019 adopted to 2020 forecast, you'll see about a 9% increase in the expenses. And these percentages break down where those expenses are being generated from, that increase in expenses, I'm sorry. So obviously, the restoration of the $4 million expense reduction, that was a one-time plug in last year's budget. And so when you pull that $4 million back into your denominator of the equation, then that's about 2%. Restoration of one-time balancing solutions. So we use some one-time balancing solutions to balance the 2019 adopted budget. And so those come back into the base. One-time solutions are things like vacancy savings, right, where we don't actually eliminate a position, but we're saying, okay, for the next 12 months, we will hold that position vacant. Big in there is that 6.2 discount rate. So we talked about that major change in assumption. That's driving about 2% of that 9% growth year over year. We have come to labor agreements with all of our safety units. The only unit that we remain out of contract with at this point would be SCIU, and up for negotiation soon will be management and UMPAPA. And so this contemplates all of the current approved labor agreements for all of our safety units. So that's about 2%. And there's other general cost inflations for kind of COLAs, contracts going up, things like, we've talked about our tree trimming contract, and that has a 3-year with baked in increases in the contract. Same with janitorial services. This forecast already accounts for all of those kind of increases. All right. The next slide is everything that's not included in this forecast. It's pretty similar to what we've talked about in the past, but you'll see a lot of capital activities on here, grade separation, and obviously longer term of potential recession. Major revenue assumptions. We have strong and healthy growth in the first 2 years of this forecast. So about 6% overall. Your taxes are growing, your primary drivers over 7%. So taxes are going to be property tax, sales tax, transient occupancy tax, documentary transfer tax, and utility user taxes. So this contemplates pretty steady growth across those, and about $9 million year over year. Longer-term projections are based on a number of factors, but obviously one thing that we do look at is that compound annual growth rate, and we also look at, for non-tax revenues, the alignment with the growing costs of what's driving the fees, which are salaries and benefits, as well as cost of living increases. Major expenses on the salary side, we've already talked about the significant change from a CalPERS perspective. There are general 2% wage increases modeled in the outer years of this forecast. So anytime a labor group is not in contract, we just model a flat 2% year-over-year increase from a salary perspective. Again, this is just for planning purposes. This isn't indicative of anything. Non-salary adjustments, we remove all the one-time expenses, and we have basically, depending on the contract, somewhere between a 2 and 3% CPI on those. The Bay Area CPI, as many of you know, is somewhere above 4%. So sometimes contracts come higher, sometimes they come lower, and so we just average it out. We'll spend a moment on this slide and probably breeze through the remainder. This slide is looking at alternative forecasts. So presented before you, and the assumptions that we just went over are the base case. The long-range forecast also provides alternative scenarios for comparison's sake. And there are 3 main scenarios that staff has run for council, and one is new from the Finance Committee's deliberations. So the first scenario is just, what would have this long range looked like last year? Meaning, had we not gone to the more conservative CalPERS discount rate, where would we be from a financial perspective? And if actually you look at that one, we'd actually be operating in the black. So we'd actually have about $1 million surplus. That's something really important to factor into the kind of analysis of this, and you can kind of see what's driving that gap between revenues and expenses. What it also talks about and shows is the really good work that this council and the organization and community did in balancing the 2019 adopted budget on an ongoing basis in a structural way. And so that was one of the goals as part of the 2019 adopted budget, was no one-time solutions, no reserves. We need to solve this on an ongoing basis. And Alternative 1 proves that we did that. Since that, we've obviously changed our assumptions, and so now we will work through those. But from what we had set out to do, we're incrementally moving that needle from a sustainability perspective. Alternative scenario 2 is, I can't predict the future, but we just modeled what happens to our tax revenues in a recession. We chose 2022 as the year to model this in.
Let's not have a recession.
Okay, that would be wonderful. So we just chose the middle of the forecast period so you could see the full kind of implications of what does it look like the years that the recession hits, how do the revenues dip and react, and then what's the recovery period look like. So just to gauge, it helps us from a financial planning perspective as well to know what our risk level is, and from a tolerance perspective, what we need to be planning. And the last one, the third scenario, is something that came out of internal discussions as well as that finance committee discussion, which is, what if we were to change the salary assumptions by 1%? So instead of a 2% growth baseline, what does a 3% baseline growth look like? We ran this for two reasons. One, it's good to understand that margin, right? So what is an additional 1% cost from a salary perspective? And two, frankly, it's a typical scenario that we do run to provide that context. So again, just some clean 1% figures. It doesn't tweak or account for any changes on the revenue side. So for example, if we were to increase salaries by 1%, arguably we would look at increasing our cost recovery fees by that same amount. So there may be some slight offsets to this, but otherwise it's a rather just clean, straight calculation. Okay, so the next slides are all graphs depicting those three scenarios. And overall, this forecast is really, again, intended to provide a high-level document for information to help inform your policy decisions, both in the near term and long term, help us establish those longer term goals and challenges. Reflecting on, we are in solid financial footing. And so how do we maintain that and even go better and continue to pay down and address things like our unfunded liabilities in a proactive fashion? So the council and this organization has really done a solid job of setting us up to continue that conversation. And as always, the city does face competing priorities, and that's part of what this document is for, is to help inform decisions around those competing priorities. We also wanted to touch on next steps. Just the items in gray, we've already passed. We're currently on the bold line, and this is just a high-level look at our overall budget process. So we start an annual budget all the way in September of the prior year and work our way all the way to June to get it adopted and ultimately published in August. So we're in the thick of it as a team right now. We're looking at proposals internally and working to balance the 2020 budget. We'll then move into preparing the documents, which will be released at the end of April to the City Council, with Finance Committee deliberations in May and City Council adoption in June. So with that, unless anyone wants to track back to certain slides, staff recommends, as well as the Finance Committee, that the Council accept this report, and the process will continue.
Thank you very much. At this time, we'll take public comment if there is any. Do we have any speakers? We do not. In which case, we return to council for comments, questions, and motions. Councilmember Du Bois.
Yeah, I'm going to start with kind of really basic questions and work my way up. So we did the long-range forecast for the general fund, right? Is there any reason we don't do it for enterprise?
Sure. Arguably, the enterprise funds do that through their financial planning and their rate setting. So they do that, and that will be coming to the Finance Committee in March and April of this year for each commodity. And through that, the rate forecasting, they do a full financial analysis of the funds, where they're at, the reserves, and where the rates need to go in terms of the future.
So kind of similar to the general fund, what kind of assumptions they make in terms of salary and benefits?
They peg off of the long-range financial report to help them build the salary and benefit costs associated with each fund.
So it was like the 2% per year in out years?
Correct.
Okay.
They actually, to be honest, they blend it, if you want to know the detailed truth.
People blend it with actual?
No, if you look at our financial forecasts, so let me look at the packet page. If you look at the, let me see. All right, if you look at packet page 944, you'll actually see a more detailed look at exactly what's in the expense side of this. And at the top, you'll see total salaries and benefits. So they look at that year-over-year growth rate, and they take that year-over-year growth rate to help them forecast out their salaries. And so
So they look at the general fund salary and growth rate, or do they look at?
correct, because this is a model of the city's financial picture and our labor contracts. So the same contracts that are governing the general fund staff are governing the utilities and enterprise funded staff.
Okay. A couple of just things that jumped out. Packet page 936. We have this kind of anomaly in year 2027 where expenses only grow like 1%. And I mean, so kind of why is that? And have we ever seen that actually happen?
Thank you for the question, Council Member. Steve Guagliardo with the Office of Management and Budget. As Kylie mentioned a little bit in her presentation, there's a lot of uncertainty that grows in the out years of these forecasts. One of the things that happens in the out years, especially with the more aggressive payment of the pension costs, is the pension costs start to normalize, even from CalPERS projections a little bit. So you're seeing the 2% across the board for salary and benefit increases. You're seeing the inclusion of various things like the pension costs, and you're seeing just a multitude of factors across the board there. In short answer to your question, it's rare that we see an increase that low in reality, but there's a number of conflating factors that contribute to it.
So there was no like big thing that happened out then that caused that to happen?
Let me look at the years. In 2025-ish timeframe, 2025 and moving onwards, some of our largest changes in our portfolio from a retirement standpoint change. So remember, your retirement is amortized over a 30-year period by CalPERS. And so once that 30 years is up, it's like a mortgage. You're done paying that portion of it.
Yep.
So every year that you have these returns, so if you think about that, you're looking 10 years out, or I'm sorry, 30 years out. So some of the big losses in the portfolio come to term. And so you aren't paying those, so your CalPERS is not going to spike that year, because you actually are going to drop off one of your larger debts.
Got it. Okay, thank you. Similar question on packet page 938. And again, it just seemed to be an anomaly. So in the year 2022, we see a large drop in rental income. And I was just curious again, is there some anticipated event?
And that one has to do with the landfill and the payments coming in from the landfill to the general fund for rent. So the last year of that is in FY 2022, and that's why you're seeing that decrease.
Okay, thanks. That's great to have an explanation. And then I saw a note in here that the long-term forecast still doesn't include the current TOT rates. Is that's still true?
That is true. Before the council tonight is the same report from November. Obviously, subsequent to that, staff continues to work on revising it as we develop the 2020 budget, and staff fully anticipates bringing that forward as part of the proposed city manager's operating and capital budgets.
Okay. And then there were some interesting comments around OPEB and this kind of growing fund, and really like to hear more about that. So the SERP trust, and what could that money be used for, and do we really think we might be able to use some of that for unfunded liabilities? I mean, it was like $100 million, right? And we're thinking it might be in excess, is that?
That is most definitely not in excess,
Oh, okay.
as
Maybe I
scary
misread.
as that may sound.
Maybe I misread that. I thought it said we
So-
might be able to use it for other things.
No, that funding in the SERP trust is for OPEB, so that is for our longer-term other post-employment benefit liabilities. So a lot of the focus in the recent years has been about our pension liabilities and talking about that and all of the projections associated with that and the 115 trust. But prior to that, all the way back over a decade ago at this point, someone very wise finance director decided to, clearly not talking about me, seed an OPEB trust. And we started a policy of dedicating funds above and beyond what your minimum contributions are to pay your OPEB liabilities on an annual basis into this SERP trust. And so it became a policy that just got ingrained. And so the city continues to make principal pledges to that trust, as well as obviously gain interest, as well as investment earnings on that trust. And it has grown to about $100 million. I hate to say this, but that's still not enough to pay off all of our unfunded liabilities associated with other post-employment benefits.
Right. I mean, it says in here we may be able to subsidize with withdrawals from this trust.
I'm sorry?
But the comment in here says we may be able to pay for other things such as unfunded pension liability. So it makes it sound like there's some excess
I see. Understood. The SERP trust, there's two trusts. There's a SERP trust for OPEB liabilities and a 115 trust for pension liabilities. Both of those are trusts, which means the funds can only be used for those intended purposes. So what would happen is if we wanted to draw down on the SERP trust, we would make transfers from the SERP account to CalPERS to make our OPEB liability payment for that year. And that would free up what we would normally budget as a contribution direct from city coffers there.
Yeah.
And we're not yet at a point where we would want to start drawing down on that reserve. When we bring forward on a biannual basis, every 2 years, our OPEB actuarial report, we go through whether or not it's prudent for us to start drawing down on that reserve. We're getting close, to your point, but we're still not there.
I mean, it seems like it'd be really interesting to see a scenario that when we do get to that point, right? I mean, is it part of the long-range forecast at all?
It's not yet part of the long-range forecast, but you're absolutely correct. When we get to that point, it is something that we can start to think about and work into. We're just still some years away from that.
Okay. And do you know offhand, what's the balance in the Coverly Infrastructure Fund?
Ooh. I don't know, but we can get that for you.
Okay, I was mentioning a couple places, and we'll come back to that.
Yes.
And then the issue about the Cadillac tax, are there things that we can do to avoid that independent at CalPERS? I mean, and is it a function of how many people take certain healthcare plans? Like if most people are taking Kaiser, does that help us? Or?
Yeah, I'm not sure about the legal parameters or what they would do in terms of implementation of it, so we need to look into if we have the ability to.
But we're kind of dependent on CalPERS avoiding the Cadillac tax for their health plans. Is that correct?
We run our health plans through CalPERS.
And we have to do that, though? We're required to do that?
Ooh, our health plans. I don't know if we're required. Pension, yes, unless you want to buy out, which is a very expensive activity. I'm not certain if we are required to use CalPERS as our healthcare provider. But we could get back to you on that.
Okay, I mean, it's pretty, I mean, it's 40% penalty, right? It would be just good to know. And then when you did your second, I guess it was called the second scenario in the staff report, I guess it was the third scenario in your presentation. It looked like we forecast a drop in revenue, but not a drop in expenses. And again, is that realistic? Or if we did see a drop in revenue, wouldn't we cut expenses?
So I think, Councilmember, are you talking about this one, the major tax revenue sensitivity analysis?
Yeah.
Sure, absolutely. If revenues were to drop at a precipitous rate, we would definitely be sitting before the council to try and balance that. This was merely trying to depict what would be in front of us to balance, meaning what would it take? If the revenues were going to drop, what would that gap be that we would need to be sitting here as policymakers trying to solve?
Okay, so the way we should really look at this is this isn't what would happen. It would just show us that we need to
This
cut
is
expenses.
our level of risk.
Yeah, okay.
Correct.
And I want to focus a little bit on I want to make sure I understand this correctly, the 9.1% increase in expenditures. So what was the restoration of the 4 million cut? Was that finance asking for an 8 million cut and then dropping it to 4 million? Or?
Let me see if I can simplify this one. Yeah, in 2019, we took a one-time reduction in expenses. The committee and council said, city manager at the time, Keene, please go back and find $4 million in cost reductions. And so from a budgetary perspective, from an adopted to adopted perspective, that's assumed as a one-time reduction until staff comes back with ongoing solutions. And the task was come back in the fall with ongoing solutions. As part of the fall conversation, we bifurcated the solution process to two. One was a short-term process and one was a long-term process. Within that short-term process, there was about 600,000, I want to say, of ongoing savings identified, but the rest of it, the remaining $3.5 or $3.4 million, got restored because we as an organization didn't adopt ongoing changes to our expense structure that would cure that. And that's what the longer term strategy was developed for, that we would start to tackle that through the longer term, more strategic action.
So because we made a one-time cut in 2019, we're adding back 4 million in 2019.
So you made a one-time cut in 2019 and you're going to add it back in 2020.
We are adding back.
Correct.
So if I understand what you're saying,
I know it's
we're
thoroughly
seeing what looks
complicated.
like a really large jump because council took multiple actions that seem to be more financially prudent, right? So it's kind of counterintuitive, right?
Yes, it is.
We used a better discount rate. We cut $4 million, and we updated our labor agreements, which is a good thing to do.
It is.
And the impact is it looks like this huge jump in expenses. It's really counterintuitive, right?
It is, which is why we wanted to break it out like this for the council, is there are very logical drivers for why the year-over-year expense looks large.
Okay. So the reason I was asking about I think it was, I don't know if it was in here or a different item tonight, but the infrastructure projects that are underway, I mean, it seems like there are several related to Cubberley. I do hope, like city manager, we're looking at like the minimal things we do and that we don't let some of these projects like just carry on through momentum, like the idea of building a restroom in the fields or redoing the track. Seems like a lot of those projects should be put on hold until we decide like if we're going to completely redo portions of Cubberley, right? So.
We're definitely focusing on the minimal necessary to keep it operating functionally.
Yeah. I think the issue of forecasting salaries come up on finance multiple times, and there's this idea that we don't want to signal negotiation strategy, but I think the way you did it here with these scenarios and saying, this is just a scenario is valid, and it's really useful to see kind of reasonable assumptions for out years, right? And so I would actually hope that we would kind of change this practice of just using 2%, and that maybe we would take maybe a blend of the last 3 years of a employment agreement and just continue that out as a forecasting number. I think if we continue to emphasize in the report that this is not these are forecasting assumptions, it in no way is signaling, intentions. I actually think it might get us to a better place in that our forecast, if we continue to increase salaries and things, it would show how sustainable the budget is or isn't, right? And so being more realistic, I think, is more useful. And again, I think we should do it in the enterprise budgets as well. Where again, even though we maybe have similar labor agreements, we may be competing for different classes of labor and they may end up costing more. So I don't know when council would weigh in on changing that practice, or is that just something you would do, or is that something that, is basically an appropriate topic for tonight? But It just
I'm
seems like
wondering
it's an
if
issue.
that's, I'm wondering if that might be part of a motion tonight.
Yeah, okay. I also wanted to note that I think pension contributions for fire and police will be 74% of salary in a few years. And that's using our internal assumption of 6.2%.
What packet page are you on? Because we have both, that's why I'm asking.
Again, maybe I'm mixing numbers too, but let's see. Yeah, packet page 945, where you talk about the safety plan. Right now, it would peak at 74%. I guess maybe that's using CalPERS discount rate.
Right, so if you look on packet page 946, you can see what the CalPERS rates are and what's
Right.
going on there. And then the marginal cost associated with the normal cost for each of those would get you to that higher percent. So that's the ceiling it reaches as you go through the term of the forecast.
So if we're using an internal assumption of 6.2%, are we in some way isolating ourselves from this?
I would say that we are differentiating ourselves from CalPERS projected rates. We're putting ourselves really out ahead of CalPERS in terms of what we think is going to happen here.
But if CalPERS, say, adjusts the rate again to something above 6.2, are we going to effectively see our percentage go above 74%? Or because we already have this assumption, have we like shielded ourselves? No.
Right, that's the real benefit of using the 6.2% is you're essentially building in that buffer. So if they lower their discount rate, they should reach closer to what we're projecting. That's what we're hedging with this policy.
Okay. Yeah. So again, just to wrap up, I think, again, the assumptions we use for salary and benefits, I think we should take a look at those. And then also, I'd really like to understand kind of when and how much we think that OPEB trust might actually be able to help the unfunded liability, even if it's in out years. So thank you.
I'm going to Councilmember Cormack in a second here, but I have noticed that a number of people walked into the council chambers here. And for those of you who just walked in, the council was, during the closed session, was unusually efficient with its time, thanks in part to tremendous organization by staff, primarily. Okay, and so we're ahead of schedule, and so if you're here to make public comment, we will take some oral communications after this action item is done for people who missed the first session, which came in somewhat ahead of schedule. With that, Councilmember Cormack.
And if I may interrupt one thing, just to follow up on the Cubberley item
Yep.
before we get rolling. Steve, I think, has the number.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but the balance in the Cubberley Infrastructure Fund was $5 million at the end of FY18.
You're always welcome to interrupt me for Cubberley. Thank you, Mayor Filseth. I just have a few general questions. This is the first time I'm reviewing this in public session, although I did take a look at it before. And I confess that the net operating margin calculation, I understand there's a sentence in there, but it's hard for me to track the numbers. Is that because there's some other number that isn't visible? Or if you could just walk me and perhaps some of the other members of the public through. I certainly understand, the one time and the accumulation of that, but if you wouldn't mind just with the net operating margin. Thank you.
Sure, so I'll go ahead and take a crack at addressing that, and we'll see how my years of practice attempting to explain it may or may not have helped me.
Okay.
So the slide we have on screen right now shows the base case and shows the net one-time surplus gap, which was that first line we saw, showing the difference in any given year between revenues and expenses. So
And that's just math.
Yep, that one's just math. So you'll notice in 2020, it's the same number. It's $2.8 million. But the next year, in 2021, your net one-time gap grows. It's $4.5 million. But that green line on the bottom is presuming that we solve any gap on an ongoing basis. So that $2.8 million in 2020, it's saying you structurally solved that. So if you take that $2.8 million that we essentially would reduce expenses or increase revenues by, and apply that $2.8 million credit to the next year's one-time gap of $4.5 million, your new ongoing gap that needs to be addressed is only $1.7 million. If you solve that $1.7 million, then the next year's 3.1 actually switches and goes over because you've solved not only that 1.7, but you solve that 2.8 on an ongoing basis as well. So it's hard to track, but what is the story it's trying to tell is if you structurally balance the budget starting in that first year and carry it all the way through, that's where you'll get in the process. So you would swing positive much earlier. So it's saying in any given year, you are balancing the budget by solving gaps and spending surpluses.
Okay, we'll go over that some other time. I'm going to trust you. I just need to work it out myself, and I won't bore everyone with that. Okay. So just so I understand the difference between all the cases, the base case does not assume negative economic growth, but it does assume a reduction in the rate of growth, right? Okay, all right. What on earth is Hopter on page 939? I thought I'd gone through all these taxes, but that one I've never heard of. I've got secured and unsecured, in lieu license fees, those I've heard before, but what is Hopter?
What was the packet page?
Page 939, it's like in the middle of the legend up there. Oh yeah, sorry.
Hopter is a homeowner's property tax exemption. These
Oh,
are the
yeah.
exemption. There's a $7,000 that you get in the property, the state pays it. So it's just it's a minor item, but you could just consider it part of secured.
Okay, so that will vary depending on whether people were occupying their own home or renting it?
Excuse me?
That would vary depending on whether or not people were occupying their own home or renting it?
Yeah, I mean, generally it's pretty stable, but
Okay.
yeah, if there was a great deal of change, yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. Am I also right in looking at the, if I look at 2020, we have a $2.8 million problem in base case, right? Okay. And the hotel tax looks like the increase in the transient occupancy tax, you're estimating at 2.6 million on an annual basis. So we're in the ballpark, right? We're in the ballpark without making major changes in 2020 until and unless we go to one of the other alternatives we discussed.
Say that one more
Okay.
time?
So it looks like about a $2.8 million problem in 2020.
Understood, yes.
Okay, so in the narrative, I don't have the page here, but I can find it, about the transient occupancy tax, you're referring to the fact that it looks like it's going to come in about 2.6 million on an annual base higher than what was in the original forecast. This is just a timing issue, right? Because this was done before.
The 2.6, you're talking about Measure E, right?
Yes.
Yes, so staff does anticipate that Measure E will come in at about 2.6%, or 2.6 million, I'm sorry,
Okay, so-
annually,
All right, so those are in the same ballpark
as,
as the $2.8 million problem?
oh, understood, yes.
Okay.
And so the policy call from a council perspective is, right, how the past TOT measure operates is it will come into the general fund and it immediately is transferred out to the capital fund.
Right,
So that's a policy call for the council and the finance committee to make.
okay.
So if it was done that way, it wouldn't solve that 2.8.
Okay, because it doesn't go to the general fund?
Correct.
Okay.
It'll pass right on through. It'll come in on the revenue side, and your total revenue will go up by 2.6. And if the intent is to dedicate that fund, Measure E, towards infrastructure projects by policy, it would increase your total expense line by a commensurate amount, straight in, straight out.
Okay, so that's just the delta, that's not the underlying occupancy rising or anything else?
Correct. That is the 2.6 million that's quoted in the report on page 8 or 940 in the packet, is specifically associated with Measure E.
Okay, just the delta. Okay, that's helpful. It also looked like there was a little bit of good news about sales tax on page 938, and that was consistent with the first quarter report as well, right?
Correct.
So might we expect to see that as positive news when we get our budget?
Possibly. I'm hedging a little. Just obviously revenues have changed up and down across the organization since we released this document. Overall, yes, they are trending on a positive direction. There are some coming business changes that may impact our revenue streams, and so we're looking at what that means. And by that, I just mean there's a new case that came down from a sales tax perspective in South Dakota. It's Wayfair versus South Dakota, so it deals with internet sales tax and how it's distributed. So there's a number of different activities that are happening on the sales tax front that some are good and some may hurt, but hopefully they'll all even out.
Okay, great. Just back on Carberly, the other thing I noted in here was the lease income, right, separate even from that. So I guess it's just one thing for staff to think about as we contemplate rebuilding it. I know we certainly have ideas about being able to host everyone in some portion of it during it, but it just triggered for me when I was looking at this. I'm like, oh, there's another thing that might or might hopefully not need to be adjusted, but potentially. So that was just, I'm sure it's on your radar. You know, just back on the change in expenses slide 7. So on the second line, the vacancy savings, am I right that these were part of the 4 million, or was this separate from the 4 million?
I was simply using vacancy savings as an example of a one-time cost. These costs in particular weren't necessarily vacancy savings. To your question about the 4 million line above, we did solve the majority of that with vacancy savings in FY19, which is why basically all of it was restored between the FY19 adopted budget and the 2020.
So what's the difference between an one-time FY 2019 balancing solution and the 4 million? Did we do something else?
Correct.
Before the 4 million?
Correct.
Okay.
That is correct. So there are a number of one-time activities that will happen in a budget any given year. For example, in this year, there were equipment purchases for gurneys for fire. There were new recruit costs. So when we have new recruits, we have to outfit them with their personal protective gear, stuff like that. There's a number of just studies, one-time things that the council will approve through the budget process, and we'll strip all those out because they're not an ongoing activity.
Okay, so we're putting them back in?
Sorry, some of them are getting stripped out, some of them are getting put back in, yes.
Okay.
Let's see, what's one that we did?
So I'll go ahead and chime in here. So in the FY 2019 budget, we looked at some of the internal service funds.
That's what it was.
And what we did was realize that some fund balance has accumulated over the past few years. Essentially, we haven't had to pay as much in things like workers' comp and in things like general liability. As such, we were able to give small one-time rate passes to the fund payers, which is the general fund and all the other funds of the city that pay into those funds. So that was
Okay, so good housekeeping.
right. And so that was one-time savings in FY 2019, but it's not going to be able to continue on an ongoing basis.
Because we have to continue to pay back into them. Okay.
Exactly.
All righty. Okay. And I guess I'll let everyone continue before we get to motions. Looking to the mayor.
You may make a motion, because I was going to make a motion pretty quick here.
No, that's
but
fine.
But you can do it too.
No, I'm good. I've got my questions answered. I look forward to seeing what my colleagues have to say.
Okay. At this point, I think I will make a motion, which is approve the staff recommendation, right? Is there a second? Seconded by Councilmember Cormack. And I will not speak to my motion now, but I will come back and say a couple things later. Councilmember Cormack, care to speak to your second?
No, thank you.
Okay. Councilmember Niss.
I'm going to support the motion, but I have some other questions. So I keep looking through this, Kylie or whomever, and I'm trying to find whether or not, because one of these on page 939, and packet page 939, talks about the property tax actuals and forecast. You know, there's several places in here we deal with the sales tax and so forth. If we look back 10 years, how accurate was the forecast then? And is there a forecast in here that I'm looking at and not seeing?
I can say with confidence that there is not a forecast in the report before you looking back 10 years to see how accurate we were. That is part of what the substance of the conversation was at Finance Committee, to do those types of deltas and look at those types of comparisons. So when we return with the budget as the proposed operating budget and speak to that, we'll talk about what's changed between the long range and that. And the intent is when we bring long range forward next year, talk about what's changed from year to year there as well.
The word is it's coming. So, but then more to the point is if you look back that 10 years, how close did we get?
I have done that on a whim. Yeah, for fun.
In other words,
I didn't want to say that because that's just...
To make it more specific, has this really got some value?
It has value in your planning as an organization. I would say it is a piece of information. I wouldn't say it's your end-all be-all. Your long-range financial forecast is not your budget. We have a whole separate process for that, and for a reason. Yes, for a reason, because your long range is, there are best guesses, there are estimates, and they are based on a point in time and assuming everything stays as is and just grows. But the council makes decisions on any given Monday about a number of things: contracts, capital projects, land use. All of these things affect what is in this long-range financial forecast. And so any one of these variables are changing on any given Monday, in addition to all the external variables. There's entire professions surrounding, economic forecasting and, when the next recession is going to hit and whatnot. And none of us profess to be those experts, but it is a good benchmark for the council to plan in the near future. And that's kind of why we were showing the chart of, if we're going to use this document to help us plan, we're going to use those first 3 years to really give us an idea of where are we heading as an organization. As you get further out towards the yellow areas, that's a lot of guesses. Educated guesses, informed guesses, but they're absolute.
So what I'm thinking is, if I look back to the forecast in late '08 and '09, I think it probably, I'm wondering what it looked like, because we looked then at one of the deepest, darkest times, and then we looked, as time went on, towards some of the absolutely best times. So that is something you can bring to us when we're in the budget. And it's really just FYI. I'm just curious as to how well we did then and how well we will do now. And I'm comfortable with looking ahead 3 years. Although, all of you must remember where you were on September 15th of 2008. You remember, I know that you remember it, when all of a sudden somebody said, oh my God, Lehman Brothers has just gone down. And so it's really hard to predict. And we've been in a very long bull market, and one has to wonder how long will this go on, and have we become, sort of comfortable with what we are currently dealing with? Are we going to be ready when something hits? And I don't know. I wasn't around in the city in 7 and 8 to know whether or not, when that happened, it was an enormous shock or not. But I know for the county it was a huge shock, and it dramatically changed all of our budgets for several years. And, it took some time for it to start to rally once again. So, as I said, I'm comfortable with this, and at the same time, the reality of it is still that this is a good tool, but as Kylie said, it's not the budget itself.
Thank you. Let's see. I'm going to ask a question. I see, Tom, you got your light on again, but can we go back to the slide number 7 for a minute? And I was going to ask kind of the same question that Tom did, so thank you for doing that. I was a little bit confused by the difference of the the restoration of city council 4 million and the 6.2 discount percent rate when 2, right? So let me ask it this way. How much do we anticipate the point was to put more money into the Section 115. How much do we expect to put into the Section 115 this year as a result of that?
Are you speaking about fiscal year 2020 or fiscal year 2019?
How about fiscal year 2020? That's what we're talking about here, right?
Yep. So fiscal year 2020, the 6.2% discount rate, that's that $3.9 million number that we're anticipating transferring to the Section 115
Okay. And
in the general fund.
And in fiscal year 2019 is the same way, right? Except we did it with one-time stuff.
Right. And so we did $4 million for the general fund in 2019.
All right. Okay. So I'm just going to make the observation. I may say it more than once over the next few weeks. I know this is a little bit of a wrench to try to figure out, where we find this money and so forth. Okay. People shouldn't lose sight of the fact of what we are buying. Okay, by doing this. Okay. What this means is that going forward, our future employee pensions in this city will be fully funded, okay? Any agency that is not at 6.2%, which is almost all of them, okay, in the state, if you're not at 6.2%, you're not fully funding your future pensions, which means you're still piling on big debts, okay? But our pensions will be fully funded, and that's why we're doing this. And as for prospective employees who might come to the city, if you come to Palo Alto, your pension will be secure. Go to some other city? Anyway, Councilmember Du Bois.
Yeah, just one quick comment, and then I'm going to attempt a friendly amendment. So I guess for me, the most useful thing in the long-range forecast is really understanding the impact of multi-year commitments that we make, because in the annual budget, we don't really see that, right? And so beyond just the kind of straight line forecasting, I think there's a lot of stuff built in here that we've committed to, right? Yeah, so anyways, I'm curious what council members think, but I talked about maybe trying to use more reasonable forecasts for salary and benefits. And I'm open to help on the wording of how we would word this, but something like that the long-range forecasts for the general and enterprise funds include a scenario that forecasts salary and benefits using a rolling average of the most recent actual increases and includes appropriate explanations for the assumptions made, something like that. So the intent is, if we have a 2 or 4 or 3 year labor contract and we see actual increases, we don't just take the last year, we would take some average and we would just straight line that out into the future. And whether that's like the scenario or it's just one scenario, I'm open to that as well.
So if I understand the amendment you're proposing, essentially what you're asking for is, right now, our practice has been the out years, we model at unrealistically low rates of expense growth, which is one of the things that contributes to these big hockey sticks we see every year on these forecasts in the out years, right? So you're asking for something more closer to the expected rate, truly expected, right?
Not even. I'm not sure if it's expected. I'm just saying base it on the actual recent actual increases.
Sorry, I meant it in a technical sense, right?
Yeah.
Right. No, but you want to ask staff for their thoughts on how to phrase that?
Yeah. Sure.
Well, I thought you were asking for an argument against, which is I'm about to give you, which is.
So again, I think there should be plenty of explanations that this is not expectation. It shouldn't factor into our labor negotiations. But.
Understanding that, I think that the reality at the table will be that to the extent that it's baked into our forecast, there will be that presumption to overcome. I think, again, this is certainly a policy call for the council, so, would simply like the council to go into it eyes open. I would note that there is one additional enhancement that we've been talking about incorporating into long-range forecasts in the future, which is the operating costs associated with capital projects. That is an area that this city has not really tackled it quantitatively in years past, and it is something that, to the extent that we're able to get a better handle on the costs of capital investments, again, on the operating side, that's something that we are looking to do in this next cycle.
So that's good. That's an issue that has, cropped up on some other county agencies that we know about.
So I'm just curious your reaction. So if we showed these kind of more realistic assumptions going forward, don't you think the long-range forecast would actually show potentially unsustainable issue, which would kind of highlight either the need to change staffing levels or change those assumptions? I mean, if the forecast is more realistic, in some ways it could be a benefit rather than having
You're
this.
arguing it gives people a false sense that we have more money than we really do.
Right, exactly.
Well, I think to the extent that, let's say, again, just hypothetically, that in past or in a current contract, that we have salary increases that reflect the relatively robust economy that we've had over the last few years, it would basically set an expectation of an assumption that that will continue into the future. On the expense side, decisions to reduce staffing levels are a very difficult decision for every council, and every city institution. And I will submit that it is an extremely difficult one here in Palo Alto. So I think that while it may set up something of a more realistic recognition of the need and the challenge ahead, actually grappling with that at both a negotiation, much less at a service reduction, which would likely be necessary, will be a really difficult issue for the city to tackle.
I guess what you would see, though, is in these charts, you wouldn't necessarily see the conclusion, you would just see this huge gap, right? And so having this kind of huge unfunded expenses forecasted out a number of years, it just seems like, again, to what Eric said, that we don't have these unrealistic low assumptions about salaries that make it look like we're going to have this huge excess in the future, which is what we have now. So I'm not sure if we're just fooling ourselves that it's helping us with labor negotiations by showing kind of low increases.
Again, certainly a policy call. I would also want to submit for the council that the relative swing for the figures we're talking about in terms of salary relative to other revenue sources and other expenses in some ways can be dwarfed. So just, again, suggestion that be taken into consideration.
Yeah. And again, the way I originally worded it was maybe it's one of two scenarios, so there's a range. I don't know if that makes staff feel better.
Sure.
Right. Let me see if I can summarize a little bit. I think what you're hearing from council is a desire that the out years of the long-range forecast more accurately reflect the best information we have about what those revenues and expenses are likely to be. And there's a concern that particularly in the out years of the forecast, they may not be as accurate as they could be. Would you say that's a fair summary? Right. So we're wondering should we ask staff, you folks think about and bring us a better way to think about, to have a better picture of the accuracy in the out years, the expected value, let me put it that way, in the out years. And Tom's suggestion is a couple of scenarios, map out the envelope or something like that. That might be right, or there might be some other way.
Okay. Sure. So the suggestion here is perhaps in the context of alternative scenarios, as just described, is a good way to position what we would be bringing forward.
understand.
include a scenario.
Would you guys be comfortable? I mean, here's what I want. I don't want council to tell staff, here's the numbers you got to put in these boxes, right? I mean, I think what you're looking here is a desire for more accuracy in the out years, right? And some way of representing that.
And potentially we'd waste less time during the year arguing about those numbers.
More of a sensitivity analysis.
We might get a unanimous vote in Finance Committee sometimes.
Well, one thing just to remember over this forecast, and I'm going to have to couch this because this is the first time that we've gone over a decade without a recession. Staff does smooth a recession essentially over the 10-year period. So when you look at growth on the revenue side and whatnot, we're not accounting for all of it. We're not accounting for the big dip in it, but part of a CAGR analysis is to look at history. And so, like I said, I have to couch this since we are now past 10 years officially from a growth perspective, but there is some level of dampening across the board, because if you're planning, we're not going to plan for the year of a recession, we're going to smooth it over the 10-year period.
Well, somebody asked about comfort and complacency, and I was comfortable till I saw your recession scenario, so.
Yep, good for planning.
So I haven't yet accepted this amendment, right? Is staff comfortable with the language here, or would you prefer something different?
So the two areas that I would ask for a little bit further clarification, one, I think it should include an alternative scenario, just so that we're clear that it's not part of the base case. And then the last one is when we say a rolling average of recent increases, that's, is there any way we can tighten that up?
Why don't you say,
salary and benefit.
I was going to say, you're going to get rid of rolling average. I was thinking of stuff like using consideration or something like that.
Yeah, you could delete the rolling average if that's too specific, but
consideration of alternate assumptions or something like that.
Sure, and if there's specific factors, because for example, right now, if you were to look at our year-over-year increase from a salaries perspective, on an actuals basis, you're going to have so many variables in that number. You're going to have vacancies year over year, and that's going to impact your year-over-year growth. But your vacancies are going to mask what your contract negotiated percentages are.
So what would you propose?
So depending on how specific the council wants to be, you can provide the discretion to staff, or if you want it to be specific, then we would need to spell out the variables. If the intent is something more realistic, I would say that you do something using a rolling average of recent experience and contractual increases. So you can kind of look at what's your overall experience as an organization of your salary growth, coupled with your past kind of contractual obligations.
I'd rather not I'd rather leave as much as possible to staff's discretion, right? So if you said using consideration of recent increases, then you can figure out whether it's a rolling average or some other method, or Monte Carlo analysis, right?
We should say recent salary and benefit increases.
Yep.
Yeah. You could change increases to changes.
Staff? Yeah.
So, Thomas, what you're looking for, and here's what I'm hearing, and maybe I'm wrong, that this include an alternative scenario for the general fund and enterprise funds using recent salary benefits. So you want an entirely different interpretation from what will be presented to us?
So in the
Am I
long-range
correct?
forecast, and Councilmember Tanaka has raised this issue multiple times, we just assumed 2% increases in all the out years rather than anything close to what we actually see. And so it's to say, make a scenario where you use something,
And by out years, what do you mean? Beyond
5,
three?
6, 7, 8, yeah.
I understand where you're going with that, but I think getting that specific is difficult. And maybe the reason the 2% has been used is because it is so difficult to do any kind of prediction.
I'm not suggesting prediction. What we're suggesting is, again, I was being maybe overly specific, but you take the last 3 years and you take that average and you just apply that out. You're not forecasting each year. You're just using a more realistic percentage than 2%.
I think it would be an interesting experiment.
Okay, so are you accepting it, or?
I'm not,
Oh, you were the second. Sorry.
Well, I haven't accepted it yet either, but is staff comfortable with this?
I think we're comfortable with the language. One just other thing to consider, the benefit of doing a 1% margin in the alternative scenario is that's scalable, meaning council, whomever, can take that differential, because it is a given 1%, and take it and extrapolate what would 3% look like, what would 5% look like, what would 50% look like. I'm just kidding. But I mean, honestly, it gives you a margin that is, yeah, it turns it into a unit. And so if we were to take some sort of rolling average, it will complicate the formula, and it will not be easy to extrapolate marginal changes.
I just want to be clear, maybe I was saying you just come up with some percentage
Yes.
that you then apply statically throughout. It's not like an ongoing average for each year into the future.
Right, so if I was to take an example, if I think I'm hearing this correctly, we would look at if we take the 3-year model, we would look at 2017, 2018, and 2019, average those years, and use that one average for 2020 and beyond.
That's what I was,
Is what I think
as an
I'm hearing.
example, right?
Right.
As an example. I mean, again,
So yeah,
fundamentally, the issue that comes back every year, actually, is that we have these charts, right? They all show massive growth in the out years because we assume very low expense growth in the out years. We all sort of know, I mean, it's like, when you set your alarm clock ahead, 10 minutes, and then you get up 10 minutes later and so forth. We all sort of know. So we look at this and we go, why do we even bother doing this for the out years? Why don't we just stop it at 4 years, right? So this is a hope to add more value in the out years of these things. That's why I understand the sensitivities. Right. So are you comfortable with this? Maker of the motion, maker of the proposer of the amendment?
Yes.
Staff's comfortable with it, so I will accept it. Councilmember Cormack.
Willing to consider it. I guess if you think about why we're asking for it, it's for more accuracy in the out years. And I think alternative forecast number 3, which Ms. Nose is describing, gets there, right? It gets us 8 years more accurate, right? And I'm unconvinced that, accuracy in years 9 and 10 is going to be of such vast use to us, as we make our decisions. So, I don't feel that it's necessary, frankly, looking at, listening to what staff has said and looking at packet page 932. I'm persuaded that it's unnecessary. I'd be interested to see what the rest of my colleagues have to say. Pardon me, I don't know the procedure for when the seconder is not accepting. It looks like the vice mayor has something to say.
Well, to really split hairs, okay, on the 1% scenario, what you'd want to do is start the add a percent scenario at year 5 or something like that, as opposed to right now, right? Because you say we think we're fairly accurate in the first 4 years, but what happens if the out years it changes by 1% at a time? Which is not exactly what they do now, but actually it might be the right approach, right?
sure, just one clarification, that 1% is added whenever we are out of contract with a unit, which is why.
So it is in the out years.
Correct.
Okay,
So
I did not understand that.
Some units, we are out of contract immediately. Other units, we are in contract through 2021, so you don't see that extra percentage point until 2022.
Got it. So
That is one
so what
differentiating
you're saying in
factor.
year 8, if the nominal forecast is 2% in year 8, then the 1% scenario is 3% in year 8.
Correct.
And if you want to have the 4% scenario, then what you do is you go back and you say, well, double what the difference was from the 1%, which requires a little spreadsheet manipulation on the part of council, but hopefully most people in council know how to use a spreadsheet. Okay. I did not understand that.
Okay. So,
Actually, I'm swinging over to Councilmember Cormack's point of view, if that's the case.
I'm not inclined to accept this amendment because I'm comfortable with staff's description of alternative 3, which I believe achieves the goals we described.
And it just happens to be, maybe it's not random that 3% gets pretty close to what's more typical of what we see than 2%, right? I mean, if it was off and we had to like triple your numbers manually for each of us, it might be more of an issue.
Okay, so your amendment is not accepted. Okay.
If people are comfortable.
Okay. So the amendment is withdrawn. Vice Mayor Fine.
I do have some questions, but I'll save them for Finance Committee. Thank you all for bringing this forward. I think as Councilmember Du Bois mentioned, we are taking on some new assumptions, which in a funny way increase some of our costs going forward, but that's because we're being more realistic about it. Otherwise, thank you. Happy to support this.
Councilmember Koo, would you like to weigh into this discussion at all?
No, you guys all did a very good job, and and actually I was at Finance Committee when this went through, so yeah, thank you.
Very good. Well, I learned something in the last 15 minutes, so thank you very much. With that, seeing no further lights, would you vote on the board, please?
Do you want to hear from the public?
We all. And so that passes 6-0 with Councilmember Tanaka absent.
And just a quick thank you to the team as everyone's in their interim roles. So thank you to Steve and Paul and Taryn, who are all here helping out on the forecasting side of this.
Thank you very much to the incredible finance skeleton crew. With that, with seeing no further action items on the agenda, we will now move to oral communications from the public. If there is interest, if anybody has shown up late and wants to speak. Seeing no cards, we'll close oral communications and we'll move to any state, federal legislative action or update? Nope.
I think I have something that's pertinent at this point.
Okay.
I need to get it from Beth.
Okay. We will then move to council member questions, comments, and announcements, and Councilmember Niss will be back with one, and we'll go to Councilmember Fine first.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a reminder to my colleagues here and everyone out in the public watching or here tonight, this Thursday, the VTA board will be voting on some of those changes to their network. So if you have comments or questions, please send them a message or show up in person and speak to them about some of the proposed changes for North County service.
I'm going to go to Councilmember Niss next, and then Councilmember Koo. Councilmember Niss, is that money?
All of you remember that a year and a half ago now at least, if not longer, you voted on something called Measure B. And Measure B promised that money would come to us, and depending on what our needs were, it would then be calculated on those. Because we have 80% or better in our road repair, we have just gotten a wonderful check to use for whatever we wish. That's my interpretation, at least. And this is the Measure B money, which, as you can see, is $303,672. So right here in writing is a very nice check that we're going to get.
All right.
So you can put that in the long-range financial forecast.
Yay.
Here it is. So it actually has happened. So this is Measure B money, and kind of nice to see. So you can see in the corner, this is from the 2016 Measure B. And if you remember, this has been in litigation for months. And not only that, it then went to appeals court as well. So this is a nice win at this point. Ta-da.
Very nice.
I think
Thank you
the
very
real
much.
thing will arrive, or has it already?
Let's grade separate Charleston.
Have you gotten it already yet? The 700.
This fits in the ATMs.
Yeah, right.
Councilmember Koo.
I just wanted to announce that the Cities Association Santa Clara Santa Cruz Roundtable has started officially last week, and so we're going on to our next monthly, it will be monthly meetings. The next one is March 27th. We're still reviewing all our bylaws and so forth, so we welcome your input.
Seeing no further lights, we are adjourned, and this is one of the earlier adjournments that I can remember in the last few years.
Eric, do you want to announce tomorrow night?
And what's tomorrow night?
That would be a good idea.
State of the city.
Just reminding everybody that the State of the City address is tomorrow night, and I believe the officially starts at 6:30 for hors d'oeuvres, the doors open, and the program starts at 7. Thank you very much and good night.
Advertised at 6:30 or 7?